On this episode of the podcast, I have with me David Ayers. He is the SVP of Engineering at Invitation Homes. We're going to be talking about hiring in the engineering space. A couple of highlights will be consistency, assessing skills. How do you know what attributes you should be hiring for? And also, do you need to be perfect? I speak to a lot of leaders, and that's actually a good one. I'm excited to have David on to talk to us about a couple of these. Thanks for taking the time. Thanks for joining the show.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
Awesome. All right. You are the SVP of Engineering at Invitation Homes. What does Invitation Homes do?
So we are a publicly traded REIT and the nation's largest owner of single-family homes. So we own 86,000 homes and then manage another 20,000 on behalf of other owners. So we've been growing both our portfolio of homes we own and of homes we manage for other folks.
So hiring and engineering, it's definitely, I sometimes believe it's art, not science, but I think there's a lot of science in here that we're going to talk about, hopefully, and try to find some of those objective components that I think people sometimes overlook. First thing off the top, I guess, when we approach a customer and we're talking about a role, I think the thing we're always trying to figure out is who is the right persona? Like, who would that embody? And I think then we get the client to rattle off this perfect person. When you're looking at hiring in the engineering space and you're trying to depict that persona, that person with the right attributes, how tight should those requirements be when you're just starting off on a search?
Yeah, I think maybe I'm not sure if this is different than many or what other people think. I'm almost don't care about technical ability, meaning skill with a particular language or how deep they are in SQL, right? I want to hire for potential and ability to learn. Those are probably the two biggest things that I care about. Obviously, you've got to have technical acumen. So I'm not trying to gloss over that, but that is not like number one or two on my list. Like, I want to make sure that people have a drive to continuously improve. And that's more important to me than I spent 3 years writing Java or whatever your technical background or skill is.
Yeah. And actually, I really like that, because I think where an engineer can go in their career and the aptitude is what everyone wants, right? Everyone wants to hire that person that's going to go above and beyond, grow and flourish and thrive in an environment. When you look for that type of person and you're trying to identify that person, there is a slight, maybe the hard skills that they've worked with, and then propensity, aptitudes, some other maybe terms that we can throw in there of their potential. How do you look for one without being blinded by the other?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. And we do, I would say for all of our interviews, even for leadership positions, we talk about both. So I would say primarily, usually we do the sort of soft skills part of the interview. And that's the first conversation we usually have, where, assessing how does this person fit? What is their attitude? What is their aptitude? And then, moving into a more technical assessment. And I think, so they're both important. And I think you can't be blinded by one over the other. And so we've tried to create a process that we can apply consistently to candidates so that it's not haphazard, I guess is the best word. That's a lot of interviews are like, yeah, I'll talk to him for an hour and it'll just be a conversation. And so when you're talking to a handful of candidates, you might ask 20 different questions of 20 different people. And then how do you possibly compare them? So I think it's important, because we actually partner with our HR team to, they rolled out a company-wide program around behavioral-based interviewing, and actually produced sort of a guidebook with questions in it and spots for notes, so that when we've got folks, anyone that's going to be doing interviewing for us goes through that training, and then they're expected to actually write down stuff in the interview and take notes on the particular set of questions. And we've hired a set of questions. We have created a set of questions, both for engineers and for engineering leaders, based on the sort of attributes that we're looking for that are important for those different roles. That doesn't mean there isn't a conversation, right? Those questions are a starting point, and we try to ask the same set of questions to every candidate. But often, we don't want to also squash the natural conversation that can occur or the follow-up questions. So I'd say we try to blend, using those behavioral-based questions that probably, if you actually timed it, that's probably 30 minutes of the interview, and the other 30 minutes are the conversations that happen because of those questions and the follow-on questions, or the things that those spark that are also important. So it's like you said at the beginning, there's an art there to taking, not just reading what's on the page, right, and being able to have a conversation with a candidate, and because you want like it's a two-way dialogue that you want to have too. It's not just you asking them questions, because they're interviewing you as much as you are them.
Yeah, that's well said. I think that's a lot of times engineering processes are so hyper focused on sussing out the best skill and not letting that other type of skill through, and we'll leave other type of skill, because I think a lot of times best in engineering is not necessarily always the right path, and that's a whole different discussion. But I do like the fact that you mentioned giving that person a chance to interview you back. Maybe it's an extra round, but I think it does help a lot in terms of the buy-in of that candidate. You mentioned consistency, and also we're talking about, if it's a software engineering role, we hopefully are open-minded, because you need a certain type of programmer. It doesn't have to be Java, could be Python, could be Go. When you look at assessing the skill and you're looking at the actual assessment process, does that make it a little bit harder for your team in terms of having to potentially be open-minded in considering different programming languages?
Yes, I think it does add a level of difficulty for the interviewer. So two things. One is, I think that many of the folks that we've got, especially that are doing the interviewing, have a polyglot background in programming. So they're not just one thing. I also think that things aren't so different. We haven't had an experience. So let me take a step back. So we'll often do a bit of design and a bit of programming in our technical assessments. And so we'll do a shared diagram, like we use Lucid Charts. So we'll open a blank document and say, like, hey, let's design a system. And so, even with lower level programmers, they have some idea of how they might put a system together, right? Our expectations as you move up, and as we're looking at an engineering manager, might be very different than someone just out of school, but they still have an idea. So you collaborate with them to design a system. And sometimes that's very simple. And then you go into a coding exercise and you're like, pick a language. You do what you're comfortable with. And so far, we haven't had someone pull out something really esoteric as the thing that they're going to program in, so I think it's, like most of our engineering leaders are capable of following along with someone who's coding in Python or JavaScript or Java. They're not that different, such that you can't see what they're doing. And because it's not even obviously the thing has to compile and the thing has to run, but it's more about the thought process. That's what we're evaluating. Like, how do you think about structuring your code? How did you name your methods? How did you name your variables? Like, those little things matter, I think, more than some of the other stuff. Like, you can Google a lot of stuff, right? But how you can't Google how someone thinks about solving a problem. And that's really what we're assessing in the technical part. In addition to, it has to work, right? So there's a bare minimum of technicality that has to be reached with their stuff, but we want to see how they think about problem solving.
This resonates with me, and I'll be curious what the audience thinks, but I've always held that programming is the skill, and people over-index on the language because it's easier to assess down into the language level for teams versus going, if you're a software engineer, that engineering skill is what it is. It's like a language. If you know Spanish or French, the other Latin-based languages are not difficult to learn. Now, obviously, if you guys are talking about something like that, now if it's going the other direction into functional programming languages, okay, that might stretch the team. That's a different. I understand that, but I really do think programming as the skill is where we've kind of gone wrong. And I think as I'm kind of listening to you, I'm going, okay, this is how I view things, and I think this is where we see a lot of hiring managers get over-indexed on, can they solve problems within certain libraries and frameworks to a certain seniority level. And I think I'm hearing from you, you can Google that. You have Copilot, you have all these other now additions, but the thought process, I guess I wasn't planning on talking about Copilot, but I think this question, your answer is going to lead into it. As we see more Copilot type applications come around and we start seeing engineers focus on design, systems, figuring out requirements, is what we're talking about even going to be more important? Is this the aptitude piece? Because we're going to extrapolate some of the basic coding that you could Google.
Oh, 100%, right? Like this, I see this as being the next evolution of how we build things, right? We used to build things on a command line, and then we had IDEs, and that was a massive, productivity boost, and it changed the way people work. And IntelliSense, like you did less typing, but you're still solving the problem. And I think this is that next evolution, right? We're going to be using those tools, but you still have to know how to solve the problem. I mean, I think it's maybe there's someday. I can't imagine it's within my career where these systems will really be able to understand the complexity of modern business and look at any particular business and understand the workflows and how, like, that all I think is going to require a person. And less it'll be about the typing, and more it'll be about the understanding of the problem and how you want to apply technology to solve that problem, which is programming.
I think it's interesting. I'm an ex-data person, so I was a software engineer, but I did a lot more work in the BI data space. But I can see how over time the tools became easier at the reporting piece of that, where a lot of people became functional, understanding the domain. Do you think as we start extrapolating out some of this like basic coding that might not be necessary, do we see software engineers become functional, going sitting out in the business, solving problems that they potentially had never had the time because they're figuring out how to actually deliver the solution? I mean, engineers are problem solvers by nature. Would they make for very good, I'm not going to use the term business analyst because that would be a completely different role, but is there analyst hat that they'll be wearing if they're not coding as much potentially? Obviously, this is a crystal ball thing. I mean, this might not even come true, but just curiosity.
No, it's an interesting way to think about it. I've always thought that programmers and anyone in the technical space should be doing a bunch of that anyway, and learning the business. So like we send our folks out to work in a field office for a couple of days, and they sit next to leasing agents, and they go ride in a maintenance truck out to a customer's house. I went and helped fix a stove. Like, I don't know what the heck I'm doing, but I'm out there gaining empathy for what our folks deal with and empathy for our customers. And so some of what you said, I think, is important even today, even in a pre-Copilot world. I think the ability to understand the problem at more than just a surface level, which I think is a mistake that a lot of shops make around, like, okay, well, those other people, those business analysts and product people will be the ones that understand the business. You just need to worry about writing code. But I think you can write better code and understand, if you understand the problem better and understand the full process end to end instead of just your little narrow niche of it. So it's an interesting way to think about it, because I think we already should be doing all of those things you said. And maybe this just accelerates some of that integration between how we think about problem solving and working together with our stakeholders.
Yeah. And not to say that it doesn't happen. I think if we were to put a let's say just a 40-hour work week. I know some people might or might not work, that amount, but let's just say 40 hours. I think if all of a sudden we're taking away a quarter of the time some engineer spends coding, that's a lot of time that they can apply to something. Obviously, companies might go, hey, you know what? We need less engineers. Okay, that is one way to go. I think the other way to go is, hey, we have a lot of people that can solve problems. How do we actually get further downstream? I guess, cybersecurity, a lot of, shifting left and trying to get closer to the engineering scope. As you mentioned, engineers already do some of the stuff. You do some of those ride-alongs, but I think with this additional time, I can't help to think that there's other things they could do. Obviously, like I said, they could just hire less engineers, which is the sad part of it. But I mean, obviously, we don't know that yet.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know about. It feels like every place I've ever worked, no matter how many people you've got, there's always more work that stakeholders want. So, like, to me, this will increase our capacity to deliver on more of the things that are already on our list to deliver. So, like, to me, this is not a play to reduce headcount at all. Like, this is a way to get more value from the teams we've already got and deliver more for our stakeholders.
I tried to, for my father-in-law, I tried to depict an analogy. He was kind of asking me about AI, and I was like, listen, 50 years ago, an accountant would have to sit down by hand, do all these computations, use a calculator, bust out journals, lots of paper, spreadsheets, whittle that down. Doesn't mean we didn't need as many accountants. I mean, accountants have grown, they flourish. And I was like, this is what's going to happen, because he was like, well, everyone's going to lose their jobs. How are people going to make money? I go, I think what you're going to see is efficiency wins. We solve other problems, which I think is what you've been alluding to. To get back to, and this one was a question I wanted to make sure I touched on, because I think it happens a lot in interviewing. A lot of times we start focusing on finding an ideal, or what a hiring manager might consider that near perfect candidate. And you say no to one candidate, hoping the next one might be better. And I heard an expression saying, the next candidate might not be better, it'll just be different. How do you help your team, especially hiring managers, how do you help them understand it's not about being perfect?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perpetual struggle. The thing about hiring is it's like going on a couple of dates and deciding to get married, right? Like you have to take a leap of faith at some point in the process. And so whether you're going to put someone through 10 interviews and exhaustive testing and take-home tests, I know some of the stuff people do now from an interviewing standpoint is crazy. And so, we try to optimize around where you make that leap of faith, and no matter where, you cannot be perfect. I mean, right? Like, we would never have to part ways with anyone if we were always perfect in our hiring, and we're just not. And so for us, we try to do the right amount of due diligence, and hopefully our interview questions and the way we approach behavioral interviewing and the way we approach our technical assessment helps. And then we don't want something to drag on. If someone's not a good fit, we want to figure that out right away. And it's best for both of us. I mean, no one's happy if they're not a good fit, and we're not happy if they're not a good fit. So we try not to worry so much about being perfect. I think that's the problem. People try to be perfect, so they have a 6 or 10 step interview process. And for us, we do 2, maybe 3, and then make a decision, right? And so with that, you're not going to bat 1,000, right? You're gonna have a few strikes or whatever. I shouldn't use baseball analogies because I'm not huge.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, we do see interview processes that are 2, 3 steps and they make it higher. We see ones that go through 6, 7, they make it higher. I haven't kept track, and actually just something maybe I will start doing is actually seeing when people hire, depending on the number of steps in the interview process, do they end up having a certain amount of fallout, within those 90, 180 days of candidates that were those, hey, we shouldn't have made this hire. I'd be very interested, because I'm of the belief that if you've are a savvy interviewer, you've been interviewing, you've been hiring for a while, you're not going to bat 1,000 but you're certainly not going to bat 50%, which I think is what the stigma of the process is in the more complicated processes. When you're talking to your team, the last question, because I know you got to get back to actually doing the day job, but when you're talking to your team, and obviously a hiring manager, their job is to hire and their job is to build their team out. It doesn't look good on them if they actually have to fire somebody they hired, and it's a reflection on their decision potentially. And I see why hiring managers get cautious. But if they do hire the wrong person, is that a reflection of them as a hiring manager, or are we being unfair potentially in how we assess that?
Yeah, and I certainly don't look at it that way. I don't look at it as a failure. Now, if there's continuous, if there's continuous mismatches, just like anything, if you see a pattern, then it's worth talking about. But in general, again, like it's very easy, even in those 6 or 10-step interview processes, people still get in that aren't good fits. Right. And so I don't see it as a failure at all. I see it as a learning opportunity. So when we have those things happen, we'll often talk about, okay, well, let's look backwards now. Like, is there something, knowing what we know now after the first, 90 days, and we had to maybe part ways with someone at 90 days, what could we have done differently? Is there something that we saw in the interview process that we decided to overlook? Or did we not see it? So to me, those are just opportunities for learning rather than something that I hold them accountable for or that's bad.
David, I know this is not exhaustive. We did not cover everything we possibly could. Hopefully we can have you back in a future episode and maybe dive even deeper on a particular area. But if somebody does want to reach out to you to pick your brain within something you mentioned, within hiring, if there's a question, is there a good way of getting in touch with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is probably the best way. It's just David Ayers on LinkedIn.
Perfect. We will make sure to include that in the show notes so somebody can reach out to you. Again, I really do appreciate your time. Thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing.
That was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, David. All right, that's it for the episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, 2 things. 1, did not definitely cover everything I was hoping to cover with David, but we will hopefully have him back and touch on some other things, especially on the leadership side. But if you did find this podcast useful, share it with somebody else who might, especially if they're in the hiring space. I think we covered some great topics. We even touched on some AI, and I typically don't like to bring in an AI question, but I couldn't help myself. Please like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the podcast is going. I'd appreciate that. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.